Okay, welcome everyone to another session of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Chelsea Estancona. I'm one of the co-organizers, along with Brad Smith. I'm at University of South Carolina, and he is at Vanderbilt University. So the OPSC started in 2015 as an extension of the Peace Science Society as an effort to expand the community and to celebrate the excellent research that is occurring both before and after our annual meeting. So you can find us via the Peace Science website. There is a tab there for the OPSC. We also have a Twitter presence if you would like to follow us there. And so today's paper will be posted both as the recording online, and it is available on the Peace Science Society website. We have a fantastic paper titled "Who Makes the State? National Ownership and International State Building in Authoritarian Context." And this is authored by Yolande Bouka, who is an assistant professor at Queen's University, Susanna Campbell, who is an assistant professor at American University, and Travis Curtice, who's an assistant professor at Drexel. And we also have three fantastic discussants. We have Naazneen Barma, who is an associate professor at the University of Denver, Meg Shannon, who is an associate professor at University of Colorado, and finally Vera Miranova, who's who is a visiting research fellow at Harvard University. So attendees, I just will remind you that you are welcome to leave comments or questions in the chat. If there is time or if it makes sense in the flow of the discussants' prepared comments, I will do my best to incorporate them. Otherwise, I'll monitor for after the discussants' comments. And so the authors will now be presenting for 15 minutes, and then we will turn it over to our discussants. So Travis, go ahead. I think you are the one sharing your screen, and please continue.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Susanna, who will be presenting for the first half.
Great. I'm actually now an associate professor, so somehow a promotion happened in between submitting, so we do make progress. So first of all, thank you so much, Chelsea, for doing this, and thank you so much, Vera and Meg and Naz, for taking time at a super busy time of the semester to give us feedback. So we're really grateful. Travis and I are going to do a quick presentation, and that is just for simplicity here. And then Yolande, Travis, and I are all going to engage during the Q&A. Travis, could you go back just so I can say the title? Okay, great. Sorry. Who makes a state? Evidence from UN liberal peace building and an electoral authoritarian regime. So the basic argument that we're making, right, is that in spite of threats to the liberal world order, liberal international states still pursue state building in post-conflict states, right? So this is very much, this whole liberal peace building agenda is still alive and well, at least in the behavior of the UN and other kind of international institutions. Scholarship largely, the peace building scholarship largely argues that international actors impose liberal democratic institutions on post-conflict states. So this is really a top-down endeavor that imposes very particular norms, institutions, ways of behaving on these post-conflict states. And yet, increasingly, these international state-building efforts occur in post-conflict states that are not necessarily progressing toward liberal democracy, or not only progressing toward liberal democracy, but they are also increasingly authoritarian. And I think in the Q&A, Yolande will probably respond by kind of breaking apart some of these binary concepts, which is part of what we're trying to do in this paper. But in the initial setup, we really want to kind of give you the scope and scale of what these efforts are. And yet scholarship assumes that even in these increasingly authoritarian contexts, international actors still impose this liberal peace agenda. So what we want to show is kind of the breadth. These are 24 countries that were eligible for support from the UN Peacebuilding Fund in 2020. And as you'll see, while there are quite a few that are electoral democracies, there are also quite a few that are electoral autocracies and a few that are closed autocracies. And so this really presents this puzzle of how the UN engages and how the UN Peacebuilding Fund engages with and supports peace building, which is based around the idea of political liberalization in these contexts, which are increasingly authoritarian. And as you see here, that this trend has changed over time, right? So the orange line is the electoral autocracy. And right now, there's a greater number of countries that are receiving UN peacebuilding support that are in that category rather than electoral democracies. So there's been a shift over time. And as you see, there's actually often been that trend where the electoral autocracies were essentially greater in number than the electoral democracies. So what we ask is, how does the UN and other liberal international institutions more broadly pursue liberal peacebuilding aims in these authoritarian contexts? Do UN experts alter their perceptions of peacebuilding depending on whether or not a post-conflict country has progressed toward democracy or seems to be backsliding toward autocracy? How do UN experts reconcile the kind of inclusive liberal reforms that they're trying to promote with the prioritization of national ownership by an increasingly authoritarian government? And what's central to understand here is that the UN is a member state organization, right? So it is supported by, it is governed by, and via territorial sovereignty dependent on the consent of the government and its national ownership. So this is a kind of a core assumption that you need to understand this project. So what we argue is that UN liberal peacebuilding efforts require buy-in from both international and domestic actors. That international buy-in really translate both into buy-in from headquarters. So in terms of a peace operation, that would be the Department of Peace Operations, and from the country office, which would be like the special representative of the Secretary General at the country level. But they also require, for the work they're doing, the consent and domestic buy-in from the host government and civil society. That host government alignment with that the degree to which the host government's preferences align with liberal peacebuilding aims is likely to vary by regime type, right? And as I've shown before, that the UN actually aims to build liberal peace in all regime types. But you can't assume that the host government and other domestic actors are going to buy into the kind of liberal peacebuilding idea and ideals and institutions when the country is actually increasingly authoritarian. So the kind of mechanism that we point to here is that in authoritarian contexts, we expect that the need for the buy-in and consent of the host government and civil society is actually going to lead UN staff to prioritize their support, their buy-in, possibly even above those of headquarters and the field office. So the kind of overall hypothesis that we're dealing with is in post-conflict contexts that are where there is closing civic space and where there is weak civil society, as compared to post-conflict contexts where there's opening civic space and strong civil society. We expect UN peacebuilding experts to be more likely to perceive domestic actor support as more important than UN actor support. So we look at this within the context of Burundi. And what you see here, which is really interesting, is that Burundi was held up as this kind of very important peace process case, a case where a conflict-affected country, a country torn apart by civil war, actually established a peace process and established democracy, right, in 2005. But then after 2005, its levels of democracy actually really began to go down, and it began this process of kind of retrenchment toward more authoritarian practices. So the UN Peacebuilding Fund was established in 2006 to support kind of broad system-wide peacebuilding via a range of political and development priorities, right? So the UN Peacebuilding Fund is trying to support countries like Burundi to actually help them to come out of conflict and establish the kind of broad liberal democratic institutions that the UN contends will sustain peace. And even though we saw that kind of retrenchment of Burundi back toward more authoritarian practices, Burundi has remained the kind of top one of the top recipients of UN Peacebuilding Fund support. It was one of the first 2 countries selected as a priority by the UN Peacebuilding Fund. And as you see on the left, it's almost has the top number behind Liberia and Guinea, the top number of projects from the UN Peacebuilding Fund, and second only to the Central African Republic. It has the most investment of the UN Peacebuilding Fund. So throughout this entire period that you see from 2007 until the present, the UN Peacebuilding Fund has remained engaged in Burundi with significant amounts of resources.
Awesome. And so I think I'm taking over from here.
Great.
So as Susanna just mentioned, part of Burundi is that Burundi is a critical case for the PBF's kind of involvement throughout several post-conflict societies, but also the UN's PBF is itself kind of a specific case of broader international institutions that are also part of this broader international order. So our methodology for kind of assessing and testing our hypothesis is that our study is embedded as part of a portfolio evaluation of 21 UN Peacebuilding Fund projects that occurred in Burundi from 2014 and 2020. And though this was the portfolio evaluation that we were conducting for this study, I also want to just highlight that this study also builds on the extensive experience and work of Susanna and Yolande in Burundi prior to even 2014. And so for our study, we did a purposive sample targeting experts with direct experience working on peace building related projects. The time frame for our study was from January to July of 2021. And throughout that period, we conducted over 80 semi-structured interviews with several stakeholders, including those at headquarters and the advisory groups, implementing partners, key management, project personnel, external observers who had experience monitoring these various projects, and other individuals who were kind of recommended through more of a snowball sampling approach. Within that 80 that we interviewed, we also conducted a survey experiment of 47 respondents who participated in the survey experiment that I'm about ready to explain. And so for our survey experiment, what we really wanted to be able to do was kind of introduce, even in a subtle way, some variation between the levels of either like peace building projects occurring in more of a democratizing context versus more of a closing or authoritarian context. And so we had those 47 respondents randomly assigned to either receive our control, which was kind of flagging a strong civil society and opening civic space. And so we call that kind of the democratization control, compared to the treatment group, which received the weak civil society or shrinking civic space, which was our way of kind of leveraging the idea that peace building projects, as we showed with the descriptive statistics earlier, are occurring also in more authoritarian contexts. So here's kind of what one of the survey primes looked like. And so at the start of the survey, the respondents would read the following prompt. I'm not going to read it all here for the sake of time, but I want us to kind of see the way that we were able to just vary that even though the UN PBF is working and is trying to is working in these post-conflict settings, that some of these challenges where they're working, that these challenges occur in countries with strong civil society and opening civic spaces, which again, that would be our democratization control. But these challenges also occur in contexts, and these projects are occurring in weak civil societies and shrinking civic spaces. And something that I also want to highlight is though the respondents who are taking this survey had direct experience working in Burundi, some of them also have experience working in other contexts that are also experiencing both democratization and kind of democratic erosion, or the shrinking civic space and weak civil society. So after kind of cueing this, what we did is we asked the respondents to kind of rate how important to the Peace Building Fund support is for the following stakeholders. And so we asked about 7 key kind of groups or individuals. So the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General, the UN Resident Coordinator, the recipient population, the UN staff, host government, civil society. And out of these 7 different items, what we did is we create and we construct our dependent variable. And the way that we do that is that we actually construct 3 kind of indexes. So the first is we rank whether or not they're saying that there's key supporters for international actors. And so we create an additive international actors index, We also then create an additive domestic actors index. And then we also have a harmonized actors index that goes from international kind of on the negative scale to domestic actors on a positive scale. And what we do then is we actually see the treatment effects of, for the respondents who received the authoritarian treatment, how does that affect their perception of the need for support, or as Susanna mentioned, buy-in from these various actors? And so we find in modeling this, so this is a standardized coefficient that's kind of mean-centered at 0 with 1 standard deviation. What we find is that assignment to the authoritarian treatment actually raises by 0.75 standard deviations support for domestic actors relative to UN actors. And so for the people who, respondents who received the kind of cue about the PBF is working in these closing political spaces, there is this pivot towards the actors saying that domestic actors are more important. Is this, though, is this exploratory analysis, is this actually confirmatory or is it exploratory? We kind of break it down and actually use the other indexes to try to begin to explore this. And so if we actually break those indexes apart, what we see here is that the treatment effect is positive for the domestic actors index and negative for the UN actor index if we actually like estimate those as independent indexes. But there's noise there in part because of our small sample, and so the confidence intervals actually overlap with the 0, and so there's some noise there. But what I also want to show is that even if we break these items down even further, we actually kind of see, even though it's statistically insignificant in some of these results, we actually see a pattern begin to emerge in that those who received the treatment effect, they all kind of they were more likely to say that the domestic actors were relatively more important, and that includes actors like civil society, the recipient population, and the host government. And for those who received the treatment effect, the coefficients were all negative for those who for the UN actor items. And so there is this kind of, we take this as suggestive evidence for the argument that we're putting forward here. But it is kind of just exploratory and suggestive, so we don't see these as confirmatory results. But what we kind of then do, and part of this is the limitations from these analysis, is that we recognize that we have low statistical power in these results. But we also have like such a unique expert sample that we really want to be able to leverage these data as best we can. Part of also maybe some of the null results might be because we used a really sensitive treatment, and that was in part because we wanted to make sure that we weren't kind of over priming these experts. So we view these as exploratory analyses, but we do think that they're suggestive. And so what we want to do next is really draw on the rich qualitative data that we actually have within this study and from the rest of the portfolio evaluation. And so looking at things like within an authoritarian context like Burundi, what is national ownership? Is national ownership kind of seen as government control? Is national ownership more about agenda setting, or is it more about governance capacity? And I want to be mindful of time, but here we actually see some pretty indicative quotes coming from several of these interviews where people talk about these various mechanisms. Similarly, thinking about the lack of national ownership for peace building, what pathways might the UN take? We can think about kind of pivoting more towards civil society and local community engagement, the challenges of funding from international NGOs, and also this pivot to there being more support for apolitical peace building and development. And I would love to be able to spend some time with these quotes because they're so good, but I think we're about at 15 minutes. And so next steps, we're in the process of kind of completing our analysis of the qualitative data, outlining the implications for these findings for understanding of who makes the state in post-conflict settings, and just some preliminary takeaways, and then I'll turn it over to the discussants. We think in an increasingly authoritarian context, peace builders have little authority to actually impose a liberal peace. And part of what we're trying to do is even problematize what do we mean by authoritarian contexts? What do we mean by a liberal peace? And what are some of these kind of normative assumptions that are baked into these concepts? We kind of show that host governments can co-opt international peace building efforts, just as authoritarian governments use seemingly democratic domestic institutions to entrench control. And international and national peace builders cope with a complex reality on a daily basis. And so this is a dance that they're doing. And I think that one of the things that we learned, or that this study highlighted, is that people are aware of this very difficult dance back and forth. And I think that our study will hopefully have implications for policymakers and practitioners about how to balance the risks and returns and the imperative to kind of remain in context and just to do something, even though it can be quite politically fraught. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Susanna to just give some context on the type of discussing comments we're looking for as we kind of open it up for discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Travis. Yeah, so this paper, we've been working on it for a while. We have a ton of data and we want to send it out for review soon. So what we're looking for is a pathway toward sending it out for review, not a kind of rewrite the whole thing or write a different paper. So if there's no pathway toward review, then that's also helpful to know. But we're really kind of looking at what we need to do in order to get this out. And we believe it's a pretty important contribution if people accept our kind of issues with our sample size and power. And so if they accept that, then we believe that we can make quite an important contribution, or trying to place it relatively high. So would just love whatever feedback and practical advice you have. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Yolande, Susanna, and Travis for that fantastic presentation. So why don't we, I'll have our discussions go in the order that I have them listed. So that'll be Naz, then Megan, and then Vera. So go ahead, take it away, Naz.
Okay, great. And apologies, I changed my background in the middle of Travis's excellent presentation. It's really windy in Denver today, and my bandwidth is a little glitchy, so I hope that I'll be clear here. But thanks, Chelsea, and thanks to OPSC. This is a wonderful initiative. I'm really glad to be here. And thanks, Yolande, Susanna, and Travis for a really terrific paper. I really enjoyed reading it, and I hope that I will indeed give you what I think is a pretty clear pathway to publication. I'm excited to see the paper come out. So I think what's really wonderful about this paper, a number of different things. First, it pulls together some really important disparate threads in the scholarship on peace building and the issues sort of adjacent to peace building in an innovative way that I think is going to really advance our understanding of what happens during the course of interventions in post-conflict states. So I found in this regard, something you said in the conclusion, especially illuminating about your conceptual agenda here, what I saw as the heart of the conceptual agenda, which is that you're highlighting the challenges in post-conflict states that are related to issues other than conflict recurrence, but are sort of really significant in terms of political developments. And I think, that's a really important contribution. So having said that, I think what I can help you with most effectively is I have several questions on and want to push you on some of the framing and the conceptual framework. And I guess I want to make sort of three interrelated points that I hope build on each other constructively. So first, I'm not sure that the interesting way that you came to this research, asking an important question about the differences of the on-the-ground reality of peace building and democratizing versus increasingly authoritarian states, and then the alignment of the UN with the host government, remains the most compelling way to frame the findings. And I think that tension comes through actually in how you move through the paper. So what was really smart and interesting in my mind was the fact that you explicitly asked the question of how much peace builders push headquarters goals versus accede to national government objectives. And there, this issue of host government consent, as you note, is really crucial. And I think this is really something that has not been investigated enough, the question of what sustains consent. So in that regard, I'm less convinced by the notion that the answer is a binary, that what's going on is you're prioritizing the preferences of domestic actors in closing civic space versus more sticking with the headquarters aims in democracies. And this is where sort of empirically, you've convinced me that the increasing importance of domestic actor preferences and how international state builders bargain and negotiate with them happens in closing spaces, but you haven't made the case that it doesn't also happening in opening spaces, which your theory actually posits currently, right? So I would argue that you'd actually have a hard time showing that, because I think even in the opening political spaces in post-conflict countries, there's an increasing recognition in the literature that there is still contestation over some elements of the agenda. It's not only in the opening civic space, it's not only in the closing civic space that those forms of contestation are going on. So it seems to me then, and I think you have a lot of really rich ways of answering this in your empirical evidence, that the specific issues that international state builders and host governments are bargaining on is what's sort of really interesting here, and I hope will drive more of the framing on the front end. It's not so much an absence of consent from the authoritarian governments. Instead, it's bargaining over how to use the leverage of consent. And I think you get to that in many ways, but that's not the way the paper is sort of currently framed. And again, I think you'll get there when you're able to dig deeper into the empirical evidence. So my second thought comes from the fact that Burundi is obviously, I think, a really great case, given the experience that you showed of the opening and closing political space. I'll observe from my research that Cambodia is a very similar context over the same time frame, although it's not a PBF country. And what happens in Cambodia is this very deliberate manipulation of the UN intervention for Hun Sen's and the Cambodian People's Party's own political purposes. What's interesting in Burundi is you have much more of this sort of dynamic contest. And so again, I'm sort of pushing on this binary point, right? Why would UN resident coordinators in democratizing context not be as involved in the pulling and hauling of this sort of interaction, the process of interaction, as they are in autocratizing context? And I think that a sort of a more robust answer to this question of what's going on in both of these spaces will help you get into the nuance of the empirical stuff. And in one place, you emphasize the reality of the daily negotiations with the host government and non-government actors that UN resident coordinators are undergoing. And that's what I want to know more about, how those negotiations are sort of actually playing out. So third, and my final comment, is where I see the sort of really valuable contribution to the literature is here, this notion that the IGO peace builders and the domestic Burundian actors are together in this beautiful phrase, making the post-conflict state, right? It comes out so much more clearly in the empirics and towards the end of the paper. And it's this making of the state framing that I think is much more convincing than the initial framing, using the critique that the peace building scholarship for the most part rests on this assumption that international interventions impose liberal peace. I think that might have been true a decade ago on the scholarship, and maybe it's still true de jure or on paper, but I think we've learned it isn't in practice. And so more nuance on this question of how this international domestic partnership makes the post-conflict state, I think will serve you well in engaging with the newer scholarship. And I'm thinking of people like Melissa Lee, Jenny Whalen, Jasmine Westendorf, and many others that we all know, on how this kind of interaction really takes place over the course of the peace building process. I have one final thought that I'll save for discussion, Chelsea, so turn it back to you.
Okay, wonderful. Way to be pretty much exactly on time. Thank you for that. Okay, let's go over to Megan. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. Susanna, nice to see you. And Yolande and Travis, very nice to meet you through your work. I actually, I didn't necessarily frame my comments around this being something to be sent out in the near future. I actually was thinking, wow, this is a big book type project. So I might have questions that are a little bit bigger picture. So take them with that. And some of these things, maybe could only be briefly addressed in a paper. I think there's still some room for them to be addressed. But one thing I kept wondering about is, what is the outcome of this process? Like, what's the end point here? What does this look like in the end? And what I was wondering is, are these choices? Is this push and pull between the UN and local actors? Does this lead to kind of very subtle, sort of nuanced outcomes, or does this have very strong effects? Like, the post-conflict state ultimately decides not to hold elections, or decides to engage in more repression, or ultimately, fails to reform the justice system. And I have a feeling it's not that it is much more subtle. But I guess what I'm wondering is what would the end of this process look like? And how would that be distinct from another type of process? And then related to that, I would love to see some of the alternative explanations for this to be addressed. So for you pose one very plausible path, but are there alternative explanations for why this push and pull occurs? One thing I was wondering about is there actually a possibility of endogeneity? Because the paper reads very much like the UN is this kind of exogenous force on the regime. But I mean, is it possible that as part of like receiving PBF, does the UN actually shape some of the actors that, even the local actors that get put into place? Are personalities actually sort of being chosen by the UN? And then alternatively, is it possible that there's other international forces that are actually leading to these types of outcomes? And something like, foreign aid driving the process or something else. I wasn't actually sure what the alternative explanations might be, but was thinking that surely there's something, and that it would be maybe good to at least be able to try to rule some of those out. And then I wondered, what launches this? It seems like there's like two different tracks here. It's either, the UN working with the government, or, the UN sort of being pushed by the government. And I was wondering, like, what actually kind of launches this process? Is there something about the post-conflict situation that kind of leads into one or two paths? Is there something important about those initial conditions? Does it matter when the UN enters into the post-conflict space? Those were all just kind of questions about the process that I had. And then, like Naz, I had a lot of questions about consent, and the causal mechanism seems to hinge on consent. And I wondered if, is consent a real concern? And this might be something where, by the way, in terms of your interviews, which are so rich and wonderful, one approach might be to weave the interview excerpts throughout the paper rather than kind of save them for the end. And I guess it depends on if you're considering the interviews to be, strict empirical analysis, or are they more, identifying the causal process? I think they're more effective in identifying the causal process, but you might look to the interviews and pull some of the language of consent to illustrate consent as a mechanism. So, I was wondering if PBF funding, has it ever been rejected by a host government, or even talked about in that regard? And then, similarly from the interviews, do you see language about, the importance of maintaining consent? And I think there is that language there, but it just seems something to give a little bit more attention to. And then I was wondering if you might discuss a case where this process did not happen, as a comparison. So, it seems like Liberia, for instance, is a case where we didn't see this, and Robert Blair has written pretty convincingly. And so why didn't we see? How does Liberia illustrate the alternative process, or sort of the contrast? I also wondered if sometimes the language in the paper switches between authoritarian and then becoming authoritarian, or becoming increasingly authoritarian. And so I'm wondering, is there a difference? Is there something about a movement toward authoritarianism that's making things particularly tense and tenuous and making the UN be particularly careful? Or is that part of the process? Is this actual growth toward authoritarianism? Is that particularly important? And then finally, you do have the small sample of experts that took the survey, and I didn't, if it was in the appendix, I didn't get to it, but just wondering a little bit more about the actual assignment of the treatment. Is it possible that there was something driving the treatment to be a bit non-randomly assigned? And hard to say, if these are all experts in similar professional situations, I don't know, but just it might be worth addressing or thinking about the random assignment of the treatment, and at least kind of assuring the reader of that. So other than that, I think this is really important. I do have one paper that I found, like kind of searching through my library the other day, that I'll put in the chat, a site that I didn't see in the references. But otherwise, I think this is really promising. It made me rethink things in a very real way. So thank you for that.
Wonderful. Okay, go ahead, Vera.
Hi, everyone. And again, thank you for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to look at the paper before it's published and hopefully be useful somehow. So my main question, again, I totally agree that I think this topic should be a book because there's so many mechanisms. And I personally worked in UN and it's bizarre in terms of like what's going on there. And, you know, to find out like from interviews what's going on there, like those people who work there for ages have no idea what's going on there. Like, so finding it out is, you know, extremely interesting and important. But again, coming from this point about how UN works, I'm not sure about this money that we're talking about here in this particular fund that we're looking at. What are other options? So for example, again, with my limited knowledge of working in UN, like there is a negotiation between the government and UN through which channels they're going to get money through, and what are conditions for other funds. So I think it would be important to at least explain how this process goes. Like I have no idea this peace building thing, but just I think there would be a reason why they get money from there and not from somewhere else, or some countries that got it from other, you know, set of funding than this one, because they have different different conditions. I would say it like that. Also, I have a comment about presentation of findings. So, like you are saying that it's a survey experiment with a small sample, right? So maybe, I mean, if you look at like process tracing and add a little bit more about, you know, like Naz said, how they were discussing inside with UN and Burundi, whatever counterparts, then you could present it as actually qualitative study with this, you know, with the survey experiment embedded there, simply because you know, as you mentioned, right, you know, before we started talking, it does raise red flag, and it will raise red flag for reviewers if we call methodology a survey. Like it just doesn't, you know, feel well here to just emphasize the word survey with a small sample. It does work great. We're saying it's a qualitative study with a survey embedded in it, no questions, but not highlighting the word survey because, you know, immediately a red flag, oh, now I have a review to write about. Not helpful. But, you know, for that, like, if you talk a little bit about the process, you know, about the process between coordination between UN and Burundi counterparts, I mean, you're fine.
Okay. Thank you, all three discussants, for really excellent comments. I'm going to turn it back over to our authors for any responses or additional questions, and I'll keep monitoring in case we have any Q&A from the audience.
I'll take a shot. So I must say, the suggestion of another book makes me a little nervous. I want to get this out as an article. And so, but I really appreciate what it tells us is that there's a lot of background material and a lot of contextual material that we need to actually address in order for you to buy our argument. And on the positive side, that it's opening up a kind of new area of investigation where we really need to take this negotiation, these different power dynamics seriously, and look at, you know, consent as something that is continuously negotiated, right? And what are the implications for how we think about peace building, state building, peacekeeping, all of these other kind of literatures when we accept that this is actually a continuous negotiation. So I think that's extremely helpful. And I think another kind of thing that I'm taking away, and then I see Travis, did you have something to add? And hopefully Yolande. Okay, well, I'll say a couple more things, and hopefully that'll spur. I think that in relation to kind of the comparison to Liberia, I mean, the hard thing here is that we really did have, you know, via Qualtrics, a randomly assigned survey experiment, right? So the randomization is complete within, or is clearly random within these 47 people who actually took the survey. And we were very careful when doing that, that we focused on people who worked for the UN or within kind of direct proximity to the UN. So that's, in thinking about survey experiments, this is a very clear elite sample. And so there have been other survey experiments that use samples with elites that are this small. So our issue really is about how we construct our dependent variable in the index. But I think thinking about, could we contrast that to a lot of the work on Liberia, a lot of the work that's done on these more quote unquote permissive environments for UN peace building, and kind of say, we can't actually test this there, but we can say that there's an inherent assumption in this other literature about the role of the host government and what happens when you change that assumption, right? And so Burundi challenges that assumption, or challenges what happens when you challenge that assumption. And really thinking about kind of positioning it in that way, I love that idea, right? At least in a frame. I mean, we don't have the, equivalent empirics to actually support that, but I think that might actually do kind of what we're trying to do. And I love, Naz, your take that, people don't think that it's just being imposed anymore. And I think as I operate in these, or that the liberal piece is being imposed, I think that we can't assume that people don't, because a lot of literature out there still operates in that space, but kind of building more on, we know the world has changed, right? We know we need to update these beliefs, and the literature needs to update it. So what does that actually look like? And what happens if you take consent seriously, which organizations like the UN have taken seriously for a very long time? So I feel like there's a kind of clear pivot there. I'm going to see if Yolande or Travis has something to add.
I'll jump in quickly. Megan, your question about like what is the endpoint, and then also suggesting Liberia is like so fascinating. And then it raises like, it's going to have to be a book. And I like, we don't want a book, we want an article. But thinking about like project level, like which projects ended up being implemented with support from the PBF in Liberia in a more consensual environment versus what has happened in Burundi, from periods of opening to periods of closing. And so part of our language is kind of messy because we talk about authoritarian, but then it's like increasingly authoritarian, because it is somewhat about the PBF is operating in these shifting environments. Even going back to that first figure, some of the countries that were like considered an electoral democracy, it's like maybe in 2020 when that plot was figured, but even now if we updated the VDEM data, some of those are less democratic than even what they were. Like, so this is very much so part of the project is like, it's not just international investment and then liberalization. Like we just, and Naz, I agree, like maybe we do know this, but still exists enough in the literature that we want to be able to kind of push back on that and problematize that. Vera, the suggestion about being careful in calling it a survey experiment, I like the idea very much so of kind of reframing it as that this is a qualitative study with the experiment embedded, because we have been like, it's a rare thing to be able to have elites at this level sit down and not just take a 45 to an hour long interview, but start the interview by actually taking a Qualtrics survey on, like we sat on Zoom and they clicked through the survey and we were able to like fully randomize which condition they were in. So we know that it was randomized. We know that like everything's clearly identified. It's just that it's such a small sample. And so being able to like not hand wave away some of our null results, but also kind of just own what the results are with the richness of our qualitative data. And I think going to your question, Megan, like instead of just dropping the qualitative data at the end of the paper, really weaving that through and motivating some of our empirics, I think will be useful. But Yolande, do you want to jump in?
I'll just add in, the conversation about consent and what we know about the ways in which the practitioners and scholars now are starting to talk about power of developing or conflict affected countries. Part of me wants to say yes, absolutely. And if you actually look at many of the scholars who are working in and from conflict affected countries, because post-conflict indicates something else, and we write it in a footnote of our paper as well, right? There's kind of an increasing conversation about agency. At the same time, however, there's also an implicit acceptance of qualified authority and qualified sovereignty, right? So I really like the question, by Megan, like who else is involved, right? So in addition to the PBF and to the UN Security Council, then you have former colonial authorities, you have regional actors, you have the African Union, you have the East African communities, you have the Belgians, the EU, all these actors that outside of this bilateral relationship also have sometimes a word to say or a way to influence the dynamics on the scene. In the context of Burundi, though, Burundi really bucks the trend by saying, no, 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 we don't care. And we will lose external funding if we have to, but PBF won't go away. And this is kind of like in the qualitative data, when we spoke with government officials, it's like the sense of the UN state of partner, the PBF state of partner, despite the EU withdrawing its support for direct funding. So, we know that it's there. We know this kind of level of agency and kind of the importance of sovereignty, but it's always qualified in, this is where critical IR scholars will say this autonomy and sovereignty is always qualified by virtue of their poverty, by virtue of their dependence to the international system. So, maybe we'll have time to talk about it with Susanna and Travis, but it's also kind of this critical scholarship that we want to kind of enter in conversation with that says it's not just a question of whether we acquiesce that they are autonomous and that they have and the need for consent, but what that consent actually means, and it's always qualified, right? So what are the implications and what theoretically what that qualification says about, the United Nations saying we need consent and the state saying, okay, well, you have my consent, and I say no. And then, the ways, and this comes out a lot more in the qualitative data, is the ways in which national ownership is a given, and yet there's interrogation whether the Burundian authorities should actually, in fact, be given the authority. There's implicit questioning in there because they don't necessarily have the capacity, but we need their consent. So, this is all stuff that we've talked about, and the fact that it comes out in your comments, I think is very encouraging because that allows us to kind of engage a little bit more with that scholarship.
Okay, discussants, do you have any follow-ups? I think I remember Naz saying that there was another question.
I do, and now I have a couple more, if that's okay. I really
Wonderful.
Appreciate the pushback on my claim that now we all know that this is, because I think you're right. I mean, we're within this group of people, we may all know that, but there's a bigger world out there, and it's an important claim to push back on. And Yolande, I think your points about sort of the hierarchy of what consent means and the imposed nature of that consent and so on, they're really important points. So I guess one thing I wanted to pick up on was something that Meg said and that Yolande also just touched on, this question of sort of how maybe it warrants some caution, to note some caution with respect to isolating this UN relationship with the host country government, right? We've all done it. I've done it. This is what the scholarship does. But if this is an everyday negotiation and contest, which again is what I think is the most interesting kind of piece of kind of what you're saying and is exactly right, then what about the other peace building actors who are on the ground? And Meg said this, exactly. In particular, and not just other peace building actors, but other international actors. Like, so if China's in there, right? And I'm not just talking about Burundi, but I'm thinking about Cambodia now. Isn't the UN going to be even more cautious and accede to the host government? And isn't the host government going to be even more empowered in terms of its own leverage vis-a-vis that consent that we're talking about, right? So the whole space matters in terms of the context. And that's not what your paper is about, but I think just sort of, acknowledging that. And then the last thing I'll say, and I think this came up from a couple of other comments, is that I guess I was confused and puzzled, and now I'm thinking about it a little bit more clearly about this notion that what's going on is the UN is intervening. That's one thing. And then another entirely separate thing is happening in the way that it's described in the paper. And push back on me if it's not what you mean, that the space is either opening or closing. To me, those two things are interactive. It comes back to the endogeneity point that Meg was making. In Cambodia, it was the UN's fault in some ways, right? I'll go so far as to say that the autocratization happened. And so treating those two things as independent, that's how I saw it in the paper, was I struggled with that.
Any additional either responses or discussant comments?
I want to take on the endogeneity issue. Right. Okay. So the good thing about a survey experiment, the way that we designed it, is that we don't actually, that is just looking at, in particular, given this treatment, what are people's preferences for who they think is most important to get buy-in from? Is that their leadership, or is that domestic actors, right? So is that the leadership of the UN, or is that domestic actors? So in that sense, in this kind of very narrow survey experiment, we don't really have an endogeneity problem, because we're just looking at, given this particular treatment, what is their preference? But within the broader, and that's nice because we don't actually have to deal with it within the method that we're using or the design that we were using, where endogeneity would really matter, right? But within the kind of broader context of Burundi, I think that there's no way we can pull these things apart, right? But what we can talk about is say this is Burundi's trajectory, right? And this is the UN's consistent support, right? So whether the UN contributed to that, whether the UN undermined it, we are not able to definitively say, but it was a partner in it, right? And I think that's really interesting, because so much of what I'm taking away from this, which I really appreciate, is that we need to draw on our knowledge of this case over time. And we have data to support, like, everything that you said about Burundi, about other actors, about, over time, we have data on all of this. And I think for me, the challenge, kind of looking at, okay, path to publication for this piece, is how do we kind of give this broader contextual environment to say, this is a case where the government has not been afraid to push back for whatever reason, right? This is a case where consent has been negotiated in a way that it is not in other similar contexts, right? Or where there's been government pushback in a way that they have not done it in other similar contexts. And so in many ways, kind of situating Burundi as the kind of deviant case, as the crucial case that it is, saying, maybe this is a red herring, maybe this is kind of the future of what UN support is going to look like. We're not sure, but we know we have something really important to learn from the dynamics of consent, the dynamics of negotiation, and how UN staff themselves adapt to that environment, right? And I think that's what our survey experiment really is, this kind of, given a choice, how are you adapting? And so if we can contextualize that within a broader description of what's been going on in Burundi, and then set up this kind of puzzle, well, given this, how are UN staff responding, right? How do they see this? I think that gets us somewhere. But I feel like in general, it's very, we don't, as Yolande said, we don't want to get into the weeds like this. We don't want this to become a book now. We want this to kind of, we want to slice in on that thing here that we can really get at. And so what I've taken from what everybody said is that we need to set the kind of broader context in order for you to even see why this is a unique response from UN staff, right? And you can see the kind of broader dynamics to understand the significance of the survey experiment in that particular measure. And I love the idea, Vera, of, use process tracing, like actually use process tracing to trace that mechanism using our other data to say, this is a process of consent, and this is how it occurred over and over and over, and how compromises were made based on that. And so then that puts in another dependent variable, right, in the qualitative material, which is that based on these negotiations, people at least argued themselves that they were making compromises, right? We don't have the complete counterfactual, but we at least have their own recollection of compromises made by UN staff, and to some degree, compromises made by Burundian officials themselves, or maybe not. So I'll stop there.
Okay, I'll do sort of a, I guess, last call for other comments or thoughts or questions. Okay. So I'll just add in here as a sort of stranger to this literature, but someone who very much enjoyed the paper. I think Travis said this towards the end of the presentation, that one thing that y'all are kind of doing is grappling with what some of these concepts really mean, right? And I had a comment early on in the paper about, well, is this really, can we really call this liberal peace building in the same way that we have traditionally used that word, if this is increasingly meaning compromises in what that concept even looks like, right? And so I think that would be, again, as an outsider to this, and so take this with a grain of salt, I think grappling with that would be kind of cool. So especially you're digging into, what does democratic backsliding mean for the UN's broader agenda, but also in an individual context for how we deal with consent, right? And I think maybe suggesting that our notions of liberal peace building are, maybe they have changed, maybe they have to change. I think that could be kind of a powerful way to frame. It's already there, just it would be interesting to see y'all lean into that a little bit more. But I certainly enjoyed the paper, and I wish you all luck with what appears to be now a paper and a book. So, just go for both. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and, yeah, I like negotiated peace building. That's good. I'll go ahead and wrap things up here. So, again, thank you to each of our co-authors for this fantastic paper. Thank you to our discussants for taking the time to read, for really considering, for offering great feedback. So you can go back and watch this video from the beginning on the OPSC website. It's also available on our YouTube page if you did miss the presentation and you want to go back and check it out. If you have comments or questions, feel free to comment on the YouTube page, or you can email the authors of this paper. And for those watching, if you are thinking about submitting, we'll be looking for submissions soon for the spring 2023 semester. And so we'll be continuing there. But for now, I'll just thank each of our authors and discussants, and we'll wrap it up there for the day. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.